Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Well, we begin yet another week of charged political activity, a report on foreign interference in the Canadian political process, and of course, President Trump's almost daily pronouncements creating chaos here, there, and everywhere as political leaders try to plant their feet and find their footing in these shifting political sands. So, two very smart people with us this morning. Darrell Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, Senior Fellow at the Monk School. And we always list all of his books. So today, to make that easier, we brought in his co-author, John Ibbitson, a longtime writer for the Globe and Mail and author of books. And I'm going to just tell people, go online and find them all, but we will be talking about at least one of them, The Big Shift, in just a moment. Gentlemen, welcome to you both.
Hi, Pamela.
Great to see you here. I still get so much response, John, to our last interview about The Duel, your book about Pearson and Diefenbaker. It's just, I literally have people stopping me on the street. So it must be going well.
It's going very well, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. So now everybody is today, wherever John is having floors sanded somewhere, I'm having sidewalks being ripped up. So if you hear noise, try your best to ignore it. And if we have to throw John off the screen, we will, but we probably won't. So let's jump in. Darrell, I just want to start with you because there was such a kerfuffle in the last few days about the polls, with one kind of poll showing that the Liberals were, zooming back up, but the others not really indicating that. This is what you do for a living. What is going on?
I would say anybody basing anything on one poll these days is probably making a mistake. Right. And we should treat them as outliers until they're proven to be in line with what other public opinion research is showing. You don't generally see them that far apart.
Yeah.
But what does tend to happen, sometimes outside of election periods, is you can get a lot of fluctuation in some of the polling, not this big normally. So I think what we're going to do is just wait and see what the other confirming information is from other pollsters, including us at Ipsos. But I should say, just to the viewers today, that one expects that when there's a leadership campaign going on, that will have an effect on what's going on relative to public opinion. People will be paying a bit more attention to it. Some people who are sitting on the fence one way or the other might decide to move off of that fence. We see the same sort of thing when we get into election campaigns. So the idea that there should be movement in polls and maybe that there's a little bit of tightening going on out there probably is valid. To the degree to which we're seeing it in at least one poll, I think there's maybe one other, I remain to be convinced.
Yeah. Okay. So, and then after the results are in, and it certainly appears as if Mark Carney, in terms of support, is the front runner, then we'll start to see after that leadership is. So John, what's your longtime political watcher? What's your gut on this? That Mark Carney, A, will take the leadership, and B, that will be a game changer?
It certainly seems likely that Mr. Carney is favored to win the leadership. He has the support of much of the caucus and cabinet. I think there's a lot of resentment inside the Liberal caucus over Chrystia Freeland's decision to publicly eviscerate Prime Minister Trudeau with her resignation and the letter. So that's likely to happen. Is that going to be a game changer? I'm not so sure. We have a situation very much like we've had before, a situation such as we had in the 1980s at the end of Pierre Trudeau's tenure and in the early 90s at the end of Brian Mulroney's tenure. In both cases, the public was simply fed up with the governing party. Times were tough. Inflation was high. In these days, housing affordability is impossible. There's a great deal of unrest and unhappiness with the way the immigration system is working. People are just fed up. There may be some cosmetic interest in a new leader who might be able to change direction in the same way that there was some interest when John Turner took over the leadership of the Liberal Party, when Kim Campbell took over the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party, but that very quickly dissipated. And both of those leaders took their parties to historic defeats. I think unless and until you could show me evidence to the contrary, whatever Mr. Carney does, or whatever ephemeral support he may gain in the weeks after he wins the leadership, if indeed he does, it is most likely to dissipate as well. And the Conservatives are favored to win a majority government.
And can you, Darrell, really, I mean, it is a change election. I mean, that's what I think people in your business would call it. So what happens now that the whole the whole CPC approach was this election is about the carbon tax and getting rid of Justin Trudeau, and those two things are likely going to be gone regardless of who wins, but certainly as well if Mr. Carney does. So does that still hold?
Yeah, it does very much. I agree with what John is saying. I mean, we are in a change environment. Do you see Mark Carney is being changed, or do you see Pierre Poilievre as being changed? I think if we ask that question of the public at the moment, if they knew Mark Carney better, they would probably say that Pierre Poilievre, if you're interested in change, it's probably Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. But the Liberals are struggling with the same problem that the Conservatives struggled with back in 1993, in which they really want to keep things going as they were going and just replace one person in the game. And that's the leader of the party. And, you know, it's funny. I watched the launch ad that Mr. Carney put out on social media, and it felt very similar to the type of that Justin Trudeau would have put out. I mean, they have some more in there about, you know, Mr. Carney's experience in international situations and how he's dealt with some issues, but the rest of it was kind of rah. And it's like, I'm looking at this guy. He's not rah. He's not, I mean, when he stands up to the microphone, he's not somebody who's going to inspire the public in the same way that Justin Trudeau did. So I think that one of the issues that Mark Carney is going to deal with is that this is Justin Trudeau's party, like it or not. I mean, he constructed its profile. He was the biggest reason that they won in 2015. And for good or bad, it has been over the entire decade his party. To drop somebody else in there and complain and make the observation or try to make the claim that it is now completely different is going to be a very interesting challenge for Mr. Carney in a very short period of time.
Well, and especially when they're basically saying the same things, which is we're going to keep spending almost at COVID situation levels, and we're going to, you know, fight there doesn't seem to be any new approach under the sun. Okay, this is the theory that goes every day. So now I'm going to ask the question. So there's one theory, and John, we'll start with you. One theory that Mr. Carney wins the leadership, goes back into the House of Commons end of March, loses a vote, goes to the polls, life carries on. There's an election, and we see what happens. Then the other theory, of course, is that Mark Carney didn't wait for this moment in time to become the prime minister as opposed to the finance minister without wanting that to be on his resume for more than 15 minutes. So that he will do a deal with the NDP. They will allow him to be the prime minister at the G7 meeting and maybe take it into the fall so that the New Democrats can get their pension. So John, as a betting man, which one of those theories, which way do you think it's going to go?
I'm strongly inclined to the first theory,
Okay.
and for two reasons. First of all, why Jagmeet Singh has said repeatedly that he intends to his party intends to vote against the government the first chance he gets. He has said that consistently ever since Chrystia Freeland resigned in December, and he repeated it just a little while ago. And I can't see why on earth he would want to prop the government up. How does it help the NDP to give the Liberals more legitimacy, to give the new leader more legitimacy? And the longer that new leader is in that job, the more legitimate that leader becomes. So it's politically against the NDP's interest to sustain the government. And then secondly, Mark Carney doesn't have a seat in the House of Commons. This whole idea that he goes to the House, there's a throne speech, there's a budget, sure, but he's sitting in the gallery watching it all. There's no way that he can get in the House at all. There's no way he can get into a by-election. It simply can't be done. And I don't see how you act as Prime Minister of the country through May and June and July and the G7 meeting, and then into the summer until the campaign officially launches, when you're not a sitting MP in the House of Commons. It's never been done before. As far as I know, it would be unprecedented. So I think they're both for the NDP's calculation and simply because Mr. Carney doesn't have a seat in the House of Commons, there's just no way this can carry on past March.
Darrell?
Well, it's interesting on John's point about Mr. Carney not having a seat in the House of Commons. There actually is a leader of the Liberal Party right now. We have a prime minister, and it's like he's illegitimate. Doesn't exist.
Yeah,
he has more legitimacy to the claim than the potential leader of the Liberal Party. I mean, if Chrysler Freeland wins the election, wins the leadership, maybe it's a bit different. But there's a third theory I think that you could maybe put on the table just to confuse things even more.
Okay, go for it.
And that is that the Liberals actually call the election.
Right.
That they come out of the leadership with some momentum. Maybe some of the polling that shows things tightening up turns out to be confirmed by other polls, and all of a sudden they're back in the game. And rather than giving the opposition parties the opportunity to punish them and give them a reason to be defeated, maybe they decide to go to the people and seek a new mandate and maybe steal a march on the opposition parties that way. So I think that that also is a consideration.
Yeah, that's a good theory as well. Like all three of them have their pros and cons. And just I know we'll get off this in a moment, but just on the numbers, because what we're seeing, the Conservatives, of course, have a very strong base in Western Canada and certainly in rural parts of the rest of the country. But Quebec as we know, has always kind of decided elections, Quebec and downtown Toronto. And the separatists are on the march there. So that seems to me would also cut into a Liberal vote. Darrell, just you on that one first.
Well, this is the trouble I'm having buying and what's going on in some of the polls that are out. I mean, the place that the Liberals really need to start expanding is in Quebec.
Yeah.
The Conservatives have their big shift strategy, which is basically the West and the car commuting suburbs of the major cities in the East, particularly Toronto, the 905. Okay, so that's their strategy. The Liberal strategy starts from Quebec and works out. I've seen no movement, even in the polls that are being disputed in the province of Quebec. So that's why this makes no sense to me.
Yeah.
It doesn't really make a lot of sense. I mean, so my sense is that unless we start to see two things happen, one of them is that the Liberal Party starts to move in the province of Quebec, which we haven't seen. They're probably stuck right where they are before all of this. And the second thing is that people start saying it's not time for a change and we don't need to have an election, which they're currently saying that yes to both. Then maybe Mr. Carney has some room to work with. But to this date, I've seen none of that happen.
I mean, you guys were writing about this, I think, in the big shift back in 2013 and the end of the Laurentian elites and everybody who's prime minister coming out of, Montreal and all of those questions. John, where do you see that? I mean, this is more than a decade now that we've been watching this realignment. Where do you think we're at?
Well, I think the big shift never went away, and it's back and it's bigger than ever. Again, unless these polls are showing some kind of trend that I find not credible. The car commuting suburbs of Greater Toronto, the 905 as it's called after its area code, is it now in complete alignment with the West, with Western voters, and that is the basis of a Conservative majority government. If the Conservatives win the 905. They always own the West. The 905 of the West gives them a majority government, and they're on their way to another one. Now, they are doing surprisingly well in Quebec. The polls show them ahead of the Liberals in Quebec, so they might actually pick up strength there. It could be a very large Conservative majority government. We also have to factor in one more thing, though, and this is an intangible. If Donald Trump carries out his threat and imposes crippling 25% tariffs
Yeah.
in February, that could lead literally to hundreds of thousands of lost jobs and an economic crisis the likes of which none of us have seen in our lifetime, and not even during the panic of 08, 09, not even during COVID. That kind of a crisis upends everything. And it's difficult to predict how it plays out politically, but that wild card has to be borne in mind.
Yeah, let's try and get in to that, because I've got these, I think it was Jim Basile this past week that said we've got to stop the stupid. Here in Canada, we have had 10 years to hear what Trump believes. Maybe not the specifics on tariffs, but on our country. But he has been signaling almost everything that he's talking about and threatening at this point. And we are reacting and in turmoil and in a panic mode, except maybe for Daniel Smith. We'll get into that in a moment too. How much of this, and I know this is wild speculation, but how much of this is him knowing that the prime minister's on the way out? He loves to toy with people. It's a cat with a mouse. And how much of this is deadly serious when it comes to 25% February 1st? I don't need your energy. I don't need your critical minerals. Where's your head at, Darrell, on this one?
I would take him as stating exactly what he believes and what he intends to do. I mean, we can, as they say, plan for the worst and hope for the best.
Yeah.
And so I would be, if I was in government myself right now, I would be preparing for exactly that. That means that we're going to have a coordinated approach across the country in which the provinces, the federal government get together with not only how we're going to deal with these immediate concerns, but what our economic prospects are going to be going forward as a nation. I mean, one of the issues that we're going to be dealing with here is that the ties that bind this country from one end to the other, a lot of them are economic or should have been economic,
and afraid. I might just add that
they're afraid, and we're all going to be true. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, if there's an exemption for oil and gas, this could potentially make the problem even worse.
Yeah.
So we're through the looking glass on this one, Senator. Nobody really knows. I think that public opinion right now is still in kind of the twilight zone in a sense of disbelief about what's going to happen. People, the average person doesn't really know, just as John was saying before, what this looks like because they've never experienced it before. But we could be in for a very difficult time and a very rude awakening. So I would, I would advise anybody who's thinking about this and who's watching this podcast that you should take him at his word and you should be preparing for it.
But John, it's hard to imagine Team Canada. I mean, as a member of the Senate, I think I've been involved in probably at least a half a dozen studies on the crucial importance of taking down interprovincial trade barriers and bemoaning the state of our productivity and that we must get ready for this kind of competition and we need to diversify our markets. Like, we have done nothing. And here we are now facing this. So it's a little hard for me to figure out what Team Canada, even if it was coalescing, would do, other than what we've heard the government and Mr. Carney and others say, which is we're just going to spend and try and bail everybody out in the short term till we figure out what's next.
Yeah, I mean, everything that you described is a very long-term solution. Getting new pipelines to water, very long-term. Reducing interprovincial trade barriers. Again, we've been trying for decades without success. It would take years, even if there is political will to do it, and it's not going to help in the short term. Daniel Smith is absolutely right. I think the imposition of export charges on energy, whether it was oil and gas in Alberta or electricity in Ontario, or even cutting off electricity exports and oil and gas exports, would be even more damaging to the Canadian economy than the tariffs, and damaging to Canadian unity as well.
Yeah.
So I think we have to respond to tariffs with tariffs, but only with tariffs, and try to hurt them, if possible, as much as they're hurting us. But it's a mug's game, Senator. We're trying to do as much damage to their economy as they're doing to our economy. That is as a textbook a definition of lose-lose as you could possibly find.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that President Trump is not right, at least not in the short term, that he can live without our energy. We're 60% of the imported oil that they take into the United States, oil and gas, and he can drill, baby, drill. But again, that's a longer term thing. That's going to take a year or two to get up. So, in fact, he does need a lot of what we have to offer. So, is this a place, John, just to get us to the table?
I'm not sure what table he wants to get us to. The Wall Street Journal says this is all intended to get Canada to enter into the renegotiations of the USMCA, the NAFTA 2.0.
Yeah, just go right there as the issue.
Right there.
Yeah.
Fine, let's go right there. I don't think you'd find a politician anywhere in Canada, provincial or federal, who would say anything other than, if that's what you want, let's go. Let's get put the tariffs on pause. Let's get to the bargaining table. Let's talk about it. But that's not what Donald Trump is saying. He's saying it has something to do with migrants crossing the border, with fentanyl crossing the border, that we're not securing the border adequately. Certainly in the case of migrants, it's very, very few. And what can we do to convince him that we are policing the border effectively, such that he would not impose the tariffs? So we don't even know what it is exactly that he wants from us. Does he want border measures? Does he want trade measures? Or does he simply want us to become the 51st state, as he derisively refers to us now, and to the Canadian Prime Minister as the governor of this 51st state? Again, I take everything Donald Trump says seriously, and this is a man who's talking about invading Panama and annexing Greenland. So who knows what his long-term plan is? And in that case, who knows what it is we're supposed to do in order to meet his wish?
But he has a theory. I mean, as crazy as it kind of sounds, if he's worried about our very exposed northern border, which it is, because we do not have means or measures in place. That's on us. We have let that fall down. He's looking at Greenland as a huge buffer, and he's got some bargaining there because he's got a base. Panama, ties a whole lot of issues, access from the south, China, all of those things together. There's kind of method in his madness there of creating some protections for the U.S., which seems to be his larger objective as much as we can discern it.
Yeah, when he says that we have this, that they're propping us up through a trade deficit, that's just false. That's just false. Yeah. When he says that they spend billions of dollars a year protecting Canada militarily, he's absolutely right. We are the only member of NATO that is not meeting the commitment to reach 2% of GDP in spending. We have not maintained our commitments in the North American Aerospace Defense Command as well. We are laggards, and they do subsidize us. And this is a whole lot of chickens coming home to roost for decades of underinvestment in Canada's military.
Yeah, Darrell, you and I've discussed this before. I mean, we brag about our healthcare system, although now troubled, quite seriously. But a lot of the social programs and benefits and the lifestyle we have in Canada is because we are looked after. We don't have that big whacking military bill because we've got until now, a friend at the South that has had our back.
Yeah, so two points on this. One, yes, I think that probably would be the counter argument from President Trump. But the second thing is, this is not a foreign policy debate. This is a domestic audience that he's appealing to. So whenever we go to them and say, like, I know all these people who are highly invested in the international trade and international diplomacy, go in and say to the United States, well, a car crosses the border 5 times. It's not going to be for manufacturing. Donald Trump's response is, well, that's stupid. Why are we doing that? I mean,
why don't we just make them here? Yeah.
In Detroit. I mean, why don't we just build them here? Or, you're so, our oil and gas is really good for you guys. And his reaction would be, well, we have more oil and gas than anybody in the world. Why would we need yours? Yeah. So it's like deleveraging all of these things that we think that are amazing for the United States and are in many instances amazing for the United States, and looking at it strictly through a domestic lens. And that's what I think he's doing. That's his reaction to China, his reaction to Canada, his reaction to Mexico, everything that he's been doing. It's all through a domestic perspective. So I think Canadians would be well advised as to start thinking about how these things actually pay off for Americans, and start talking to them about that, not in a threatening kind of way, but in a way that says, hey, we're kind of maybe a bit on your side in terms of making these things better. Exactly like John was saying, which is, on defense, you know what, you guys admit it and say, yeah, you do that, and here's what we're going to do in order to fix that. If you perceive that there's problems at the border, we have a responsibility to try and clear that up. And our view is, well, this is kind of, over-egged and ridiculous, but for him and his domestic audience, it's not. I mean, if you take a look at the last election campaign in the United States, the top 2 issues were the economy, which trade relates to, and immigration. Okay, so he's serious. So we need to be serious too.
The advice that I always got when I worked in New York as consul general, which is stop hectoring us about how your system is superior and your people are superior, and figure out a way to make your country and your contributions remind us what the benefits are. So when they wanted to shut down the border after 9/11, it was to make the case about why New Jersey, imports so many, paper products. And if you really want to continue doing this, but not in that, we'll shut you down and we're, so this is what troubles me about how we've got to handle this approach. If we're too nice, it's described as kowtowing and we're trying to please them. And if we brag and say, you need our oil, and so, we don't need to pay attention to you. Like, this is walking a much more sophisticated, nuanced line than we're used to walking.
It really is a question of competence. I was in Washington for the Globe after 9/11, and John Manley and Tom Ridge, who was the Homeland Security, I believe, at that time, they sat down, and in a series of meetings, they negotiated an accord to keep the Canada-U.S. border open. And what you had at that time was just a very high level of competence. You had the Chrétien government had powerful and skilled and experienced ministers, and the people representing the United States for the Bush administration were equally skilled. What we need now more than anything else is a John Manley. We need people, especially at the federal level, who have the experience, who have the skill, who have the competence to represent Canada's interests. And I mean that in some ways I'm making Chrystia Freeland's argument because she maintains she's the person who has that skill and that competence. The problem with Freeland is simply that she's deeply unpopular with this administration. And do we want to put someone in who is that unpopular? But more than anything else, the Globe and Mail had an editorial on the weekend that said Canada needs to grow up. And I think that's exactly the right phrase. It's time to put aside the pettiness and the bickering and the partisanship and recognize that we have an existential crisis that is facing this country, and we need the very best people doing the very best job.
And that's the question, Darrell. Have we trained up the very best people in the last 10 years with the focus this country has had on, the climate and what the fate and state of the oil and gas energy sector is, and we haven't put a lot into that, managing that relationship. We kind of got a bit lazy.
We also have a bit of a fantasy about what our situation is in this country. I was sat in on something yesterday on TVO where I was a panelist, and I was sitting beside a political science professor, and her thing was it's all about clean energy, clean jobs, the economy and climate are all mixed together, and we could have something with all the this new technology and things that could create everything that needs to happen, and we need to really focus on that, and we could be a healthcare superpower. And she was going on about these things. I'm sitting there going, I don't think she understands that 25% of Canada's exports are actually energy. They're actually oil and gas. What do you think pays for all of this?
Yeah.
Right. And if all of a sudden that's not the source of wealth for this country, what is going to be the source? I mean, we talk about hydroelectricity from Quebec. That's only 1.5% of our exports. That's it.
Yeah.
The automotive sector in Ontario, it's 6% of our exports. That's it. Now, it's incredibly important to Ontario, and hydroelectricity is incredibly important, obviously, to the province of Quebec. But we are so dependent on oil and gas in this country, mostly from the province of Alberta, a bit from Saskatchewan, a bit from Atlantic Canada, to basically pay for everything. I mean, if you look at the provinces that require oil and gas basically paid for transfer payments in order to run their social infrastructure, I mean, we can't do it without them.
And putting an export tax on them or paying them to shut down production is a double problem, because then we're not generating any of the capital that funds everything else in this country.
So we've played like none of this matters.
Yeah.
For the last decade. We've played like none of it matters. The provinces, other than Alberta and Saskatchewan, have played like none of this matters, because we've fought over things like, for example, the extension of infrastructure to be able to get oil and gas to alternative markets. Just as John said, it's taken a long time to get here, and the last 10 years didn't help. And by the way, I keep hearing about Trans Mountain. Trans Mountain was not a new pipeline; it was just a doubling of a route that already existed. That's why it was possible to do it, and they made the infrastructure so difficult to build due to the regulatory environment and not supporting it politically that the Canadian taxpayer had to buy it out. I was around all of this when it was happening. Yeah. So to be bragging about that is a bit rich. But we've got provinces that have resisted building this infrastructure. We have Indigenous communities that have resisted a lot of this kind of stuff. I mean, who pays for what do you think pays for all of these things that all of these people use? So we're in this kind of fabulous sort of view about how the international economy works, and particularly the Canada-US trading relationship and how the finances in this country work. And this is going to be a very rude wake-up call about this, if this actually does happen.
So I guess, John, and you've said this, we're almost now at wait and see. Like when February 1st comes, we see what happens. But we haven't trained up any other muscles really, other than to just say, we'll spend our way out of that. I haven't heard much else. Now, whether that is, through punitive countermeasures or export taxes that we impose ourselves, or some forms of compensation when industries or people are thrown out of work. Like, what else do we need to be doing? We need to start spending a little bit more on the military and our NATO contribution. Like, we need to do some other concrete things.
They have to be very visible. So I would say, yes, first of all, no export charges, no export taxes. That's only going to make the energy, the economic crisis even worse. And by the way, just as an asterisk, Line 5, which takes gas from Alberta to Eastern Canada, goes through Michigan. So if we cut off our exports, we'd also be cutting off our exports to ourselves as well as to the United States. So there's that. But yeah, a very public demonstration of exactly how we plan to invest in the military, probably through NORAD. So working with the Americans to say, look, we all know that NORAD needs to be modernized. What exactly is the plan? How can we contribute to that plan? How else can we contribute to Arctic sovereignty? Should we be buying a fleet of submarines? By the way, the answer is yes, we should.
Yeah.
What other steps can we take to project force in the Arctic area to meet our NORAD and NATO commitments, and put that out there and see if that helps.
Yeah.
Add on that, Senator. Can I just add something on that? The one mission that we know for the Canadian military that the Canadian public, so just bring public opinion back into this, strongly supports is anything for the North.
Yeah,
Anything for
exactly.
the Arctic. And it has the convenience of being something that the Americans really care about because it's part of what they consider to be their almost domestic space. So having help on that and legitimate help on that would be something hopefully that would be seen positively in Washington. And the other point on this, unlike foreign wars in Africa and other things, the actual threat in the Arctic is real.
Yes.
It's real. And we're going to see China running icebreakers up through there.
Yep,
we're going to be seeing the Russians.
they've been there mapping the floor for a long time. Yeah.
So the threat is actually real. So if Canada wants to invest something in defense, let's start talking about our Navy. Let's start talking about our Air Force. Let's start talking about our Army and the resources that they need to be effective up in that battle space. Because if we can help the Americans do that, we're not only helping them, we're doing something that's very well aligned with Canadian public opinion when you look at defense spending, and also is in our own national interest, leaving aside the United States.
Let me go off on a bit of a tangent on that one, but on that notion of where Canadians are and what they respond to. So we've seen President Trump do these dramatic things like I'm ending DEI, I'm ending affirmative action. There'll be no men and women's sports. There's only two genders. We're going to the green new scam is going to come to an end. All of those things. If there was, so two questions, Darrell. So are those the resistance to those ideas that is very clear in the US? Is that resistance here as well? Would it be acceptable? And would doing anything about those things here, saying, oh, we're ending DEI in the military, would that in any way, do you think, be of interest to Donald Trump? Because it seems to be top of mind for him.
Possibly, but I mean, it's. I think Canadians would see it as fiddling while Rome burns.
Yeah.
I mean, the other issues that we're dealing with relative to Donald Trump are so much
big
that I think that and there is a lot of these issues that are controversial in the United States are actually settled in Canada. So abortion is a settled issue in Canada. Yeah. It only becomes an issue when the Liberals decide to use it as a wedge issue. But it's pretty much a settled issue. The issue of, for example, gay marriage is a settled issue in Canada that people should not be discriminated against based on any of their orientations or ethnocultural backgrounds. Those are settled issues in Canada. In the United States, they're not so settled. So if the Poilievre government goes down that road and says that this is going to be a big part of their focus, I think Canadians are going to be a little confused and maybe a bit upset. But that doesn't mean that have things gone too far in the tastes of the general population in certain ways in Canada? Yeah, probably. Is there some room to maneuver on some of these things? Yeah, there might be. Is it going to be as big an issue in Canada as it is in the United States? I'm not talking about the people who have been on the progressive side and been pushing this. I'm talking about people who are more conservative voters. The values of conservative voters in Canada are not triggered by these things to the same extent as they are in the United States. So I think Poilievre, if he does get into power, and Carney, if he does get into power, and he's thinking about what he needs to change, there are probably things that relate more to what John was talking about before, and we've been talking to up to this point.
John, to that point, I mean, we're also seeing, I guess, some of the big institutions and the stores use the cover of this debate in the United States to say, you know what, we're pulling back from DEI policies because we really believe in merit, and we're pulling back on only funding green projects because we're going to need oil and gas for 25 years. So it's more just cover for them to do what they think is the right thing.
Yeah, it's remarkably hypocritical on the part of the corporate sector that they cared about diversity, equity, and inclusion when it was about Justin Trudeau and Joe Biden, and then they stopped caring when it becomes Donald Trump and probably Pierre Poilievre. Yeah, it is hypocritical. But I think the more important thing is that we not the Canadians don't want to see their government obsessing on these issues.
Yeah.
I'm a strong supporter of trans rights, but I fully understand that our federal government should not be spending most of its waking time working on the trans right file. It should be working on the immigration file. It should be working on the housing file. It should be working on the productivity file. It should be working on the energy file. In these very difficult times, I think people. There's not a question of whether what their position is on DEI or on trans rights or even on global warming. What they want is a government that is relentlessly focused on economic issues, on security issues, because that's what's top of mind to them in their own lives.
So this, someone used the phrase the other day that Trump has become kind of an avatar for public revolt. So it is this kind of, he's going to do a lot of things that will make what we do here look more reasonable. And Darrell, to your point, more acceptable to the Canadians at large, because our values are a little different, or at least our response to the rhetoric is different.
Yeah, well, I would say that there will be a lot of people in Canada that would say a lot of the progressive agenda has gone too far.
Yeah.
So, everything isn't about the climate.
Right.
Everything isn't about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We don't need to hire more public servants to do, all of these kinds of things. They need to be public servants who are focused on the kinds of, and laws that are focused on the kinds of things that John's talking about. So I expect that there will be a correction, because honestly, I think if you went out and you surveyed the Canadian public on some of these questions, for them, they've gone too far.
Yeah.
So I think that we will see a bit of a swing back, but will it be a highly motivating driver of public opinion over the space of the next while? No, I think we're going to, there's a big light on the horizon that's going to blind everybody else to anything else that is going on. And to the extent that the government goes down those rabbit holes, just as this last government went down those rabbit holes, that they end up alienating the public from institutions in Ottawa. And that's really what the damage has been in all of this, is been that Canadians, and one of the reasons they want change is they feel that this government has an agenda that's not aligned with the public agenda. And we've tested this. We've gone out many times and asked these questions. So, how big are these issues? Everything from Indigenous rights to, multiculturalism, or whatever you wanted to take a look at. How big are they in terms of your level of priority? And the answer is not big at all. We've got these other things that we really, really care about. So I think, when we get a new government in place, regardless of whoever is going to be in charge, their focus is going to be on another agenda than what Justin Trudeau's was.
A final word on from both of you on a big key player in what is going to unfold and how this debate carries on, and that's the media and how they represent this. So, John, I was just reading you were reviewing a book on the Globe and Mail recently, and how papers, legacy media, played such a role in the past. And with the decline of legacy media, it's chicken and egg. The decline of trust in legacy media has also been the big issue. So where are we on that? Is the media sophisticated enough? Can they put their own agendas aside to actually more fairly report this? I'm getting really mixed signals from what I see on the screens and the newspaper pages. I mean, you cited the Globe editorial, it's time to grow up. I mean, John Manley was saying that 10 years ago. You're absolutely right. It's time for us to grow up and pick up the bill at the table and not run for the washroom when stuff happens. But we still hear the rhetoric of progressives, the Democrats in the US, and certainly here, anybody it has a pejorative. The conservatives are right wing, the liberals and the Democrats are progressives. There's a pejorative tone to it all. Are you seeing any changes that are positive, or are you seeing changes that are negative? So, John, to you first, and then Darrell.
It's not so much a question of the perspective of the media. It's, again, the question of the capability of the media. the Globe and Mail is fine. It, along with the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, a select number of national high-end publications that have been able to establish a paid digital subscription base. They're as healthy as they ever were. Most of the other daily newspapers in North America are either closed or operating at a small fraction of what they used to operate at. When I joined the Ottawa Citizen in the late 80s, there were almost 200 people in the newsroom. There are a couple of dozen now at most. So the Citizen is not the paper it used to be. And that's true from Vancouver to St. John's and across the United States. So that's the first issue. Papers just aren't capable anymore. And network news is not far behind. The major newscasts are again operating at a fraction of what they used to operate at, and so all of them are being replaced by social media, by new startups. Some of them are quite good, but they generally again lack just the heft of what is needed to say properly cover an election. It takes several dozen reporters to properly cover a federal election, and apart from the Globe and CBC and CTV and Global, I don't think there's any organization left with that kind of resources. So I worry about the issue of polarization in the media, but mostly I worry about the decline of competence in the media, simply because most of them are, frankly, if it weren't for the Trudeau government subsidies, most of them wouldn't exist.
Well, that's what and everybody's taking the subsidies, even the big ones, including the Globe, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And that fundamentally undermines trust. How can, are you really going to bite the hand that feeds?
Yeah, I mean, the Globe would be fine without the subsidies. Though, of course, if there is, I'm not speaking for the Globe's management here.
No, I understand. Yeah.
But my understanding is that the Globe would be able to go on without subsidies, but many other news organizations would not.
Darrell, on this whole question of trust and whether people actually believe the stories and that are being told to us at this very crucial time. I think you're right. People are taking this very seriously. I think they're afraid. They were already with the affordability crisis. This is going to exacerbate it. Do they trust the people who are the intermediaries in this to give them the facts they need?
Generally, they would be more skeptical than they were in the past, but they still get most of their news from like television. They still do see that, if you're reading a story in the Globe and Mail, that it's probably credible. They still believe, even, as much as we hear from the Conservatives about the CBC, the people who use that service still, that's where they get their information.
Yeah.
But what I do worry about on a bigger level is at a time in which Canadian identity and pride in Canada has never been lower, and this is something that we measure, what are those cultural institutions that are bringing the nation together and telling the Canadian story or the Canadian perspective? That's something I'm very concerned about. I mean, in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, we had the Massey Commission that took a look at this. Now, you can argue with what they came up with, and it maybe was only appropriate for that time. And a lot of it was government subsidies and, of federal arts organizations and the rest of it. We can talk about how effective and biased they are in terms of the kinds of things that they support. But the idea that we need to have something in Canada to be able to tell the Canadian story, particularly if the media organizations are in the situation that John is talking about, needs to be a concern to us all. So we're probably at some transition point in all of these kinds of things. And some of the older institutions are going to be able to adapt to whatever this new requirement is going to be. And there are going to be new institutions that start to emerge. What they will be, very hard to say. Will they have the capacity and competence to be able to deal with the information needs of Canadians? Also hard to say. Will they be able to tell the Canadian story? Awful hard to say. And our ability to do these things are all part and parcel of being part of us, being able to remain that unique species on the northern part of the North American continent that George Grant, John always laughs when I bring up George Grant, that George Grant talked about. I think we're imperiled on some of these things, and the Donald Trump thing and the tariffs and the 51st state is like a trigger in a bringing together of a whole bunch of things that we've ignored for a long time that we're going to have a bigger conversation about going forward, regardless of what happens with just the economic parts of it.
I was surprised and interested when Trump decided to rename Mount McKinley, kind of repatriating history, which is some of what you're getting at. We need to get back to telling our own story and the true story and the story in some appropriate context. Just a quick final word, John, to you on that.
Yeah, I reviewed a very fine new biography by Patrice Till of John A. Macdonald and made the point in the review that it's time to stop tearing down the statues. Darrell's absolutely right. The Canadian story is something that Canadians don't understand as well as they used to and don't believe in as much as they once did. And we need to always look with clear eyes at our past, but we need to recognize that there is an awful lot to this country. It is still the best country on earth, and it was built by people like John A. Macdonald and many others. We need to stop tearing things down and start building them up.
I think that's a good note to end on. Gentlemen, thank you. Always love the conversations with you too, but also when you put your heads together and write those books, it's a really valuable part and contribution to what you've both just been talking about, which is remembering, recognizing who we are and celebrating a little bit too. So thanks so much, John Ibbitson, award-winning author and journalist with a endless career in writing, and I don't think you've given it up at all. I think you're just slowing it down a little bit.
Barely getting started.
Okay, next chapter. We're watching next chapter, and Darrell Bricker, the CEO of Ipsos Public Affairs, and I always do this, or I try to do this, who has been so active in supporting our military in this country, and more now than ever, we need to make sure that they're funded and have things there. So thank you for your work on that too.
Thanks. And I should say one last thing. Maybe John may not like me doing this, but we're working on another book.
Well, I bet you are.
Yes, bet you are.
And, any hints? Any hints?
John?
Think of it as this conversation updated and accelerated and coming out in the fall.
Excellent. I'm sure I'll talk to you before then, but for sure then, but many times in between. Thanks so much, you guys.
Take care now.
Soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
And that is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. We'll see you all again very soon too. Thanks.